Hi BookTube, and welcome to my April wrap-up video. Got 9 books here, which represents quite a good reading month for me. However, I've realised that by working my way up from the lowest sort of rank to the highest ranked book in these wrap-up videos, it means I tend to start off on a bit of a negative one with the sort of the lower ranked. So I might have to revisit that in future wrap-up videos, because I'm starting with this. Elliot Murphy, Unmaking Merlin, Anarchist Tendencies in English Literature. And this is going to be a rant, I'm afraid, because this is a 1-star book. So what interested me to pick it up in the first place was, in literary theory, you have sort of Marxist theory, you have Freudian theory, but you don't really have sort of anarchist sort of theory and interpretation of books, because anarchism isn't really one body of thought. You have sort of anarcho-syndicalism, you have libertarianism, you have the sort of the green environmental anarchism. So you can't really apply one body of anarchist thought to any kind of analysis. But what this book seemed to be offering was that unploughed tract of, books, and that would include plays, poems, essays, biographies, letters, that show an anarchist slant in them, and that I found that very interesting to dive into. But unfortunately, in this book, there's almost none of that. So it starts off with George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, which is a piece of journalism which informed by Orwell's experiences in the Spanish Civil War. And that's undoubtedly about anarchism, and he saw it firsthand, and the fact that it was crushed by Stalin. So that sort of gets off to a decent start. And then chapter 2, we move on to Christopher Hitchens, who is a journalist. Yes, you could argue he's an essayist, but the argument in here is basically tearing Hitchens down. It's not sort of offering him as a sort of an anarchist literary writer. So I don't quite understand what that that's about. Then it offers one of Ursula Le Guin's books. Now, English literature can have a wide definition to include anything written in English, basically. But when you call it Unmaking Merlin he associated with Arthurian legend, that plants us firmly in Britain. And Ursula Le Guin is not English. Neither is James Joyce, who he also claims as sort of anarchist tendencies. And if he is genuinely claiming Joyce as British, then that represents a type of sort of colonialism that he sort of later, and quite rightly, goes on to sort of condemn in this book. So he's really scratching around to offer any examples of anarchism in British writers. There's a chapter here called Workers and Writers, which is entirely about the British media and the British education system, and how they've been corporatised, and they have to reach out for sponsorship and advertising, and how that sort of takes off any edge about them, which are perfectly legitimate arguments, but they have nothing to do with trying to trace strands in English literature that may or may not be anarchists. And that's the problem with this book, because he has no material to work with, and it's just the excuse to pay off whatever political scores he wants to settle. So his tone absolutely betrays that. So all the time, basically people he's in favour of get a favourable adjective or epithet, and people he doesn't get a very sneering one. So I'm going to read you a little bit just to demonstrate this. The renowned Jewish philosopher and Talmudic commentator Emanuel Levinas falls clearly onto Hegel's side. One of his many studies of the phenomenological school of philosophy bears the exciting title Discovering Existence with Husserl. Like Hegel's phenomenology, its words would no doubt be welcomed amongst small groups of mid-teens narrating their first experiences with LSD. Quote, to say one doubts reflection is to suppose that reflection at least gives us this doubt itself. Furthermore, when one says that states of consciousness are modified by reflection, one presupposes that the non-modified states are known, for otherwise one could not even suspect the modification, nor even the possibility of reflection itself. End of quote. Levinas' internationally celebrated study continues in much the same rhetorically inflated vein, having been translated into a number of languages, though not oddly Hebrew. Perhaps this is for the best. The Jews have suffered enough. I mean, that's schoolboy level of, score settling. It should be better than a work of serious critical thinking. And it's only in the last chapter that you actually offered two writers, British writers, who may or may not have anarchist sympathies. One is John Cowper Powys, and the other is Shakespeare, because Caliban apparently is an example of a sort of an anarchist sort of thinker disgusted with the current state of the world. And then there was another one, but that is not across Shakespeare's body of work. And Shakespeare was many things to many people, as we know. And one of the things Shakespeare was he was a propagandist and apologist for the House of the Red Rose, who won the Battle of the Roses and secured the succession to the British throne. So if you're calling him an anarchist, you could also call him a monarchist. So this is just drivel, I'm afraid. And I really resented the fact that I paid money for this. And obviously Zero Books, who publish it, are in the capitalist nexus, market nexus, so they're not going to refund me. But I think the author should refund me as because I just feel utterly misled by this. 1 star, and it was lucky to get that. On to the second book, Patient X, by David Peace. Now, David Peace is one of my favourite writers, and there are two types of David Peace novels. One is the sort of internal consciousness of the main character, with sort of all its manias and obsessions and fixations, very much sort of stream of consciousness. And the other is sort of his Japanese style novels, because Peace is married to a Japanese woman and lives in Japan most of the year. And this is his first book that combines the two. It is a Japanese style novel, but it's absolutely about trying to get inside the mind of its protagonist, who is the Japanese writer Ryunosuke Akutagawa, who wrote Rashomon, which is not actually the story that the film Rashomon was based on, but that film Rashomon is based on one of his stories called In the Bamboo Grove. Slightly confusing, but anyway. And he's mainly famous for these short stories. And he committed suicide of a drug overdose at about age 35, something like that. And I'm not quite sure. I mean, it's sort of subtitled The Case Book. And in that sense, of trying to get inside the mind of someone who's going mad, yes, I can see why it's a case book. But why is he called Patient X? That I never really discovered in the book why it's sort of called Patient X as the title. So this is 12 stories, very much interlinked, based on the writings, the fiction writings and the short stories of Akutagawa, but also his sort of personal details of his life. And some of them are very effective. Like the second one is called The Hell Screens, which was the title of one of his short stories, which I haven't read. But it's got a brilliant section. He grows up dirt poor, but he has a love of reading. So most of the books he gets from libraries. But he does own some books, and he realises in order to be able to afford to buy more books, he has to sell those books. And there's a beautifully sort of described section where he's sort of, wrangling with, if I give these books back, I may never get them back. And what if I forget things that are in them, but I need to buy more books? And the only way to do that is to sell these. And it's a fantastic, again, it's that sort of obsession playing over and over, trying to work out the solution to this dilemma he faces. And that's a brilliant section. And interestingly, it's in the second person singular. It's like, you did this, you did that. And I think that sums up this book, because although it's the only chapter that is in second person singular, this seems to be Peace talking to his mentor, or a mentor of his, even though obviously they never met. He's called, the writer, in some of the chapters, calls his masters sensei, which is the Japanese word for teacher. And he, in turn, as he becomes more famous, he is called sensei by those following after him. And to me, this is Peace in dialogue with his absent sensei. But the problem is, it reads like a private, intimate thing, and I felt excluded from it. As I say, there are some very powerful chapters. There's one on the aftermath of the 1923 Tokyo earthquake, where the real destruction was wrought less by the quake and more by the fires that came in its wake. And it's such a descriptive story in here that it's like it is like viewing hell. But I don't know what it is about this book. It just didn't work for me. As I say, it just felt too private, too intimate, and that I wasn't invited. And the one refrain in the book, the one obsession that peace offers is, how can any of us escape except through faith, madness, or death? And those are the three streams running through this. Lots of writers in this book commit suicide. Japanese writers commit suicide, and I'm sure that happened. But it just seems just that writers are these sort of oversensitive, too sensitive for the world creatures, and they will only get crushed. Madness, of course, it's his descent into madness. His mother was insane, and he's very worried that he's going to end up like her, and in the end, he does. But for the first part of his life, there's no signs of it. And the other is faith, because he investigates Christianity, which obviously historically was persecuted in Japan by the shogun, and that's why Japan wouldn't open itself up to Europe, because it was afraid of sort of the missionaries sort of spreading the influence of Christianity amongst the Japanese population. So those streams are all in there. Each sort of gets a devoted chapter itself. But without that one line sort of saying, what are the three options? Faith, madness, and death. They don't hold together. And I just found this unsatisfying. As I say, I think it was too private, too subjective and personal to peace for me to be able to get much out of it. So I gave this 3 stars. Next are a couple of books which I read for the Man Booker International Prize, and they have their own videos, so I'm not going to talk about them much here, other than to say Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Sadawi, and Vernon Subutex 1 by Virginie Despentes. I both gave 3.5 for, and I can't see either of them winning, although both have made it up to the shortlist, so either could win it. But I'll post the link to the longer analysis of both of those. Now, next is a friend of mine's book, which I read as a PDF, and it's called Dream Poem by K.D. Rose, who's a writer friend of mine in America. And I'd read her first book called Heavy Bags of Soul, which is very much a mixture of sort of new physics, quantum physics, with spirituality. This, I felt, was a much more personal, focused collection. I think there were concerns with old age and dying. She's about my age at 50, and it struck a chord with me because that's an obsession I've been ploughing in my own writing for about the last year. One of the stories is called Just Shy of 80, and it's a poem that concerns her father being hospitalised, and she goes to visit him, and he asks for a cigarette, saying, "Well, what harm can it do me now?" And they share this very tender, intimate moment of smoking a cigarette, in the hospital. There's another poem called Who and What We Are, which sort of juxtaposes the sort of the gross materiality of the human body, and the fact obviously that sort of fails and stuff, with the sort of the poetic soul that we have, that we create art from. But I'm just going to read a sort of couple of snatches of her poems. So the first poem in the book is called X, and it's after Allen Ginsberg's Howl, because it riffs off the famous line in Ginsberg's poem saying, "I saw the best minds of my generation." So they moved with surety once, but never again. With age their pages lost, their songs unsung except to one another, temple to temple, all night long, cost again by Burning Man and Outre Suave, Sign of the Times and Y2K, like the best minds produced exiles in rivers, damned by those who bar the crossings. So I really like that. It's I like the assonance in it, and it's one of her sort of political poems. There's a lot of anger. I think there's anger towards sort of ageing and the sort of the injustices of the human condition. But there's also some political poems like this one about the state of America, that are quite angry. And yet, as I say, I felt they were more personal. In this one it's, Sign of the Times, so it's sort of referencing Prince. In other poems it references Joy Division and Nirvana, both of whose lead singers committed suicide. So, as I say, for me this felt much more personal. Another poem, this is from The Immensity of Moments. Time is the poetry of devouring. It eats emotions with delicacy. Time wears a facade of lace doilies and proper table manners. Like frogs boiling in water, too late before you realise it, time devours all feeling from memory. Which I just thought was sort of beautifully nails, the enigma that time is. And the final bit that I'm going to quote from the poems is, this is from a poem called Venus Undone. My voice has grown dead, a desert in need of a lozenge. Aphasia is a dirty word. I've pointed thoughts that lose their way amidst cowardly synapses and perhaps the medication required to sleep. So again, it's this sort of, it's about the sort of the waning of our powers with age and life, and a sort of lament for it. I think the word lament sort of runs throughout this collection, and I found it sort of powerful and poignant. And then the last two parts of this, one is an essay, which is very, very good. And just to quote from that, slim volumes, on the other hand, poetry is a key example, build vertically with ever-expanding circles, tangents and some linear thrown in dents. So again, just sort of riffing on the difference between, say, prose and poetry. And then the final thing is a short story called Empath, in which the main character can see the colours of people's conversations as they speak. So through that she can tell that, you know, their true meaning. Because of course we use words, but we can use them deceptively to hide our true emotions behind it. But this character in the Empath can see right through that. So I gave this a sort of a 4.5 stars. And on to the next one, a Vladimir Nabakov, Pale Fire. So this starts off with a poem about basically death by a poet, an imaginary poet called John Shade, who has a job as an academic, to pay the bills basically. And it's a lament for his dead daughter who died tragically young in strange circumstances. And a guy called Charles Kinbot comes to the same university and sort of befriends him. And John Shade, the poet, is shot and killed very suddenly. Although I guess when are you shot and killed? Not suddenly, except if it's a firing squad. And Kinbot sort of gets hold of the poem that he was working on just before his death. And the rest of the book is Kinbot, sort of as a literary executor, commenting on this poem, which is called Pale Fire. Now, as I said, ostensibly, it's a lament about death and dying, and particularly about the death of his daughter, Shade's daughter. But Kinbot, in his commentary, increasingly sort of takes over the poem, saying, no, it's about all the stuff we were talking about, and I fed him all this stuff because Kinbot comes from a country called Zembla, which is not exactly clear where it's from. It's somewhere between the Baltic states and Scandinavia and Russia, but it seems to be separate from all of those. And Zembla was ruled by a king who was deposed in a revolution, locked up, but managed to escape with the help of an actor, and eventually made his way to the States, where he was pursued by an assassin sent by the revolutionary forces called Gradus. And Kinbot's argument is that Pale Fire, you can see all the way through that this is about the approach of the assassin to John Shade to kill him, and that this is all about sort of Zemblan politics and all of that. And so the whole of the critique of this is trying to sort of steer this poem away from what it ostensibly is into Kinbot's own personal agenda, because Kinbot is Zemblan and he's got a point that he wants to get across. And it's very subversive. It's quite satirical in that way, about sort of literary criticism and literary theory. I gave it sort of 4.5 stars rather than 5, because I have to say that a lot of the sort of description of Zemblan politics and history I just found a bit dull. It was much better when it was more about literature and poetry and literary criticism and the lives of the poets. But when it went back in time to all this stuff, it was less engaging. But it's typical to Nabokov. It's just it is utterly engrossing. Next, Clarice Lispecter, Hour of the Star, 4.5 stars for a book with the word star in the title. This is the second Lispecter book I've read, and they're both superb. They're both very, very short, but her style is just a winning one, really. So there's a writer who is trying to write about a woman called Maccabea, who is and it's a sort of dialogue between them. And Maccabea is someone who has no imprint in the world. She lives in absolute poverty. People don't notice her walking in the street. She rarely gets to eat. She has no sort of relationships. So by way of illustrating that, so this is about Maccabea. And when she woke up, she no longer knew who she was. Only later did she think with satisfaction, I'm a typist and a virgin, and I like Coca-Cola. Only then did she dress herself in herself. She spent the rest of her day immediately playing the role of her being. So she's sort of so doesn't leave a marker or awake in the world that even when she walks in the street, it's almost as though she doesn't exist. And yet for the writer, who Lispecter interestingly makes male, so it's herself but in male guise, he is attracted to her because she seems to have more grace about her than he does in his own life. I write because I have nothing else to do in the world. I was left over and there is no place for me in the world of men. I write because I'm desperate and I'm tired. I can no longer bear the routine of being me, and if not for the always novelty that it is writing, I would die symbolically every day. But I'm prepared to slip out discreetly through the back exit. I've experienced almost everything, including passion and its despair, and now I'd only like to have what I would have been and never was. What I have to do is copy myself out with the delicacy of a white butterfly. The idea of the white butterfly comes because if the girl gets married, she'll marry thin and light, and as a virgin in white. Maybe she won't get married. The fact is I hold a destiny in my hands, yet don't feel powerful enough to invent freely. I follow a hidden fatal line. I have to seek a truth that is beyond me. So they're very much sort of symbiotically tied. I mean, obviously a writer and their character are, but he's identifying. He has everything that she doesn't. And yet they're both sort of, without sort of gravity, able to leave no mark on the world. I just found this a fascinating book. 4.5 stars. Robert Eaglestone, Contemporary Fiction, a very short introduction. Now, I was recommended this by the book chemist who recommended this, Literary Theory, which I haven't read yet, but I will be reading next, and a third book called Critical Thinking, I think, or something like that, which didn't interest me so much. And as the book chemist says, these are very simple, beautifully written introductions into contemporary fiction. This one, obviously, and they just pull together all the ideas in a simple, coherent, digestible form. So after taking us through sort of the Victorian canon and sort of the principles of the classical novel, he then goes into modernism and then goes into postmodernism. So that's by way of introduction, and very useful ones, I think. I think he has quite a good grip on modernism and postmodernism. And then he goes into the contemporary novel, and mainly about how they've sort of reined back from the high experimentation of both modernism and postmodernism, and yet use elements from them both, but not in such a sort of all-encompassing, radical way. And then he considers time in contemporary novels. This is an absolutely crucial factor in any novel. So he considers the treatment of the past, treatment of contemporary times, and treatment of the future. So when he talks about the past, he's really looking at sort of the role of historical fiction and the role of history in fiction, where an author sets out, even if they're not writing historical fiction, but they place their novel in a specific time through history, which we get an awful lot on if you think of the whole Hilary Mantel sort of thing. And I was sort of pleased to see that he basically comes to the same conclusions that I do, that this is a chimerical sort of pursuit, that you can't actually nail down accurate history in literature, because literature has to have sort of style and metaphor in a way you're not really allowed in history. Now, I will leave a link to my review of Laurent Binet's HHHH, which I expand upon this whole thing from the viewpoint of my degree was in history. So I go into quite a lot of detail of the problems and the discrepancies between trying to apply history to literature. And I think Eaglestone feels similar, so I was sort of quite pleased by that. When it comes to the contemporary, he points out that There's an awful lot of writing about migration and the immigrant experience, and an awful lot about terrorism, which are undoubtedly true. But does that sort of cover all contemporary work? Sort of current fiction set in the contemporary times? I don't think it does, but I thought they were interesting ways into a wider conceptualization of how we take things that are current in the world into a book that is set in the present. And then the future was very interesting because we're not talking science fiction per se here. We're talking literary fiction, but he talks about mechanical thinking. So it's not just about sort of how gadgets and the internet and all of that is sort of stripping of us of our sort of human interrelating. It's bigger than that in it, and it's mechanical thinking that changes our whole sort of conceptualization. And he offers Kajigu. It's a guru's Hold Me Close, as which deals with clones, and also A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan, which uses sort of all the sort of current technologies. So I found that very interesting. He also points out a trend that it seems in order to sort of talk about the future or what's happening now with a view to sort of future development of technology and things, there's an awful lot of current books which use children as important, either the narrator or an important character in the book, because children point the way to the future, obviously. Now again, I've done an episode which I'll put the link to about child narrators in literary fiction and how that's fraught with danger, because the main thing is getting the language of the age appropriate to the child characters is really hard to get that right in a literary book that uses literary language. So all in all, I thought this was a really good little sort of guide and sort of introduction, really. So 4.5 stars. And I'm looking forward to the next one, which is Literary Theory, but it's a different writer. It's Jonathan Culler. So there's no guarantee of consistency. And finally, my 5-star read, The Earlie King and the Kid in Yellow, which was recommended to me by Liv Hooper at the Book Nook. And she sort of waxed lyrical about its language, which is the main thing that attracted to me, because the cover, which is like a cartoon doodle to me, certainly wouldn't. And the subject matter, reading sort of what it was, sort of, it's a sort of gangster tale to some extent. That wouldn't particularly engage me. But Liv was absolutely right. So what this is, it is a dystopia. It's set in Dublin and sort of the rest of Ireland, where it rains every single day, and sort of chemical and environmental blot has just blighted the country and sort of destroyed half of its sort of traditional sort of forms of employment and stuff. And into this vacuum come a gang led by somebody called the Earlie King, and they basically deal in sort of drugs and all sorts of stuff, and they effectively run the country. They do have an antagonist who is called Vinnie de Paul, who is an arsonist, and he takes great glee in sort of setting fire to anyone who harms the people, be that the government or corrupt bankers, or in this case the Earlie boys. And over his shoulder is Mr. Violence, who is a sort of symbolic figure who just is like a moth to a flame. Anywhere where there is violence, which can be in childbirth through to murder, and he's always there, just sort of feeding off this violence, and all these sort of brilliant characters. But it is the language, and it is this sort of ruination, the sort of poetics of ruin that Danny that Danny Denton sort of conjures up. I once bought a book on the basis that it described, this is the descriptions of rust and ruination, and it wasn't at all. Whereas this, you can feel the rain all the time. You can feel it soaking the ground. So as soon as you put your foot on it, it sinks into this sort of waterlogged quagmire, and the city is just sort of rusted, and so corrugate warehouses turn their backs so they couldn't see. Forests of old defunct aerials looked away so they wouldn't witness. Floodlights on solitary masts closed their eyes to all that happened in these bad yards. Voltage boxes sat low in the water. Abandoned train carriages faced the other way. Stacks of concrete sleepers played dead. A whole skyline of relinquished cranes and masts and pylons and dark high rises were too far away to claim to have seen anything. Fire escapes leaned drunkenly. Then the road rose out of the water like a slipway, and they came upon land. I mean, I just think, the language is fantastic. It's lyrical and poetical, but it's, without trying to be it, it is slightly off kilter. The language that the gangsters speak, it is a sort of a sort of gangster slang, but one that sort of has a sort of uniqueness of its own. The basic premise is that one of the young runners for the Earlie boys, who's called the Kid in Yellow, has made the king's daughter pregnant. She dies in childbirth, and her dying promise that she wrought from her father, the Earlie king, was that he wouldn't take it out on the boy. So, to all intents and purposes, they're not going to punish him. But the boy thinks, well, this is my child. Why is it staying with the king's family? I want my child. Even though he's completely sort of, he's 13 years old. He's completely sort of unable to, look after it properly. And he manages to steal it back, which to the king means that he's no longer bound by the promise. So that's the premise of the book. But it's just, it was so powerful in how all this was portrayed. The relationship of the 13-year-old kid in yellow and the girl who dies in childbirth. It's very tender because they don't really have the linguistic and the conceptual tools, not only because of their age, but because of the society they live in, which has been stripped of sort of normal human emotions and relationships. But they find a way. They find a way to sort of communicate and get over their sort of love for each other. It's told in sort of fragments. Every chapter is called bit called. There's a play. There's scenes from a play in it, which will always get my seal of approval because I've done the same in my debut novel. So just everything about this book, in a really unpretentious way, I felt, is just so satisfying. It's not high literature, and on one level it's a sort of dystopia, but it is literary, highly literary without being sort of high literature, if that makes any sense. It's not Jane Austen and Charles Dickens and the classical canon. It's much simpler, but much, for all that simplicity, so affecting. So you can luxuriate in the language, in its rhythms, in its metaphors. And I just loved that book. I thought it was stupendous. So there you have it. That's my roundup for April. Please feel free to comment on any of the books if you've read them, like them, dislike them. Particularly if any of you have read Unmaking Merlin. I'd love to get your comments on that. But also this, because, last year I really struggled to do my top 5 reads of the year because there weren't many 5-star reads. But already, what are we now? Month 4. And already I've got a top 5. And obviously some of those might get kicked out by books I read later in the year. But, this year seems to be a much more satisfying year for reads for me. And this would go into that leading group. Now, whether it stays there by the end, we'll have to wait and see. So there you have it. Thanks very much. Till next time.